26 volunteers are spending their Australia Day in Perth's sweltering conditions to prevent the eviction of a family, including 6 children. Organised by the First Nations Homelessness project, the volunteers are fixing public housing rentals in 40-degree heat. Researcher Gerry Georgatos joins me now from Perth. Gerry, thanks so much for talking to us today. Can you explain to us the kind of work that's going on in that sweltering heat right now?
Well, 26 good souls from all around Perth, all walks of life, have come together through the First Nations Homelessness Project, which in itself is a volunteer organisation that's gone for 2 years straight and has a 100% track record in preventing evictions from public housing rentals of predominantly large families, and also a 100% track record of preventing child removals, working with child protection authorities to keep children with their families. This is a signature piece program that needs to be soaked up by the government instruments of our nation in terms of child protection and Department of Housing in terms of keeping families together. They psychosocially support families, they validate them, they work on the ways forth, they refuse to disengage, and they do the practical bit where they work with the families to repair, to fix, to sort what needs to be done in terms of public housing issues. And we've got 26 volunteers today who on this day, whether we call it Invasion Day, Survival Day, or to some Australia Day, have decided to spend their day in 40-degree heat making the repairs, the sorting out, the fixing, and it's 26 people that arrived at 8 a.m. in the morning and are still there now as I'm going to wear with yourselves. So it's goodwill, but it's also the ways forward in how to prevent evictions of particularly large families into homelessness, and most Australian households would not know the extensiveness of homelessness of large families on our streets, particularly in the urban masses, and it's extensive. And one statistic which is harrowing is the reality that there are 18,000 children aged 12 years and less living on our streets in this country, in this relatively affluent country. 18,000 children, 12 years and less. But the ways forward are to psychosocially support, to work with aberrant behaviour, but to understand that some families are that impoverished and they're living so far below the poverty line that they need other people to support them. And the way we should measure the health of a family is through the eyes of their children. And these 6 children, who are one of many families that have been supported by the First Nations Homelessness Project, are rich in their love and also longing for one another.
The issue of homelessness and those stats that you cite, they're extraordinary numbers. And when it comes to the Indigenous population, does the issue of homelessness affect that community even more?
Oh, absolutely. The narrative is one of a grim reality. Look, my predominant work is a suicide prevention researcher in this nation. We have 1 in 18 of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths say suicide. That's the official statistic. But the grim reality, the staggering, harrowing statistic is that it is more than likely 1 in 10 because of underreporting issues. In terms of your question of evictions, it's disproportionate, radically disproportionate, the number of First Nations homelessness, First Nations families who are being evicted onto the streets. It's in the hundreds each year, the eviction of families into the streets or into a state of houselessness, and then shifting around and then putting the children at risk of being removed by child protection authorities because of the lack of stability of housing. So half the homelessness in Perth, for instance, itself is actually of First Nations people, despite them being less than 2% of the population. But half the homelessness is actually of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's an abomination, moral, political and otherwise. And as a suicide prevention researcher, I'd like to denote this statistic. The most elevated risk group to suicide in our nation is individuals who as children were removed from their biological families. Thereafter, it's former inmates, and in the first year post-release, they're 10 times more likely to lose their life to an unnatural death or suicide than in any time while in prison. And then the group thereafter are recent evictees, particularly large families who have been recently evicted from their homes, and members of those families are at elevated risk to suicide and other aberrant behaviour.
All right, Gerry Georgatos, good to talk to you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, much respect.